In 2013, China announced a plan so vast, so unprecedented, that global leaders called it the project of the century. President Xi Jinping introduced the Belt and Road Initiative, a sweeping vision to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through a new web of highways, railroads, seaports, energy grids, and digital infrastructure. It sounded like a rebirth of the ancient Silk Road, reimagined for the 21st century. A network that would transform poor nations into economic hubs, ignite trade, and position China as the engine of global development. More than 150 countries, most of them low-income or developing, rushed to join. China extended billions in loans, promising prosperity, modern infrastructure, and opportunities that Western banks and the IMF had refused to provide. Beijing presented itself as a benevolent partner, offering hope where others had seen only risk. By the mid-2010s, China had poured $1.2 trillion into BRI projects, but the money wasn't charity. It was debt, heavy, complicated debt. Loans structured in a way that ensured Chinese companies, Chinese labor, and Chinese materials handled every major project. In reality, BRI wasn't designed to uplift the world. It was built to export China's excess industrial capacity. Its factories were producing more steel, cement, and machinery than the domestic market could absorb. Its engineers needed work. The solution was simple: build abroad, lend abroad, and secure geopolitical leverage abroad. But this strategy planted the seeds of crisis. Economists started calling BRI a form of debt-trap diplomacy. Give loans to vulnerable nations, lock them into long-term repayments, and if they default, gain control of strategic assets. The first major warning came from Sri Lanka. China convinced Sri Lankan leaders to build a massive deep-water port at Hambantota, promising it would become a new Dubai, a thriving hub on the busy Indian Ocean shipping route. But feasibility studies already showed the truth. Sri Lanka didn't need another port. Colombo, already a successful transshipment hub, handled most of the traffic. Still, Sri Lanka borrowed $1.3 billion from China and allowed Chinese firms to build everything. The port opened, and almost nothing happened. Barely 30 ships visited in an entire year. No revenue, no trade boom, only rising debt. By 2017, unable to repay the loan, Sri Lanka surrendered the port to China under a 99-year lease. It became the most symbolic example of BRI's hidden cost, how a sovereign nation could lose control of critical infrastructure through financial pressure. But Sri Lanka wasn't alone. Across Africa, Asia, and Europe, a pattern was emerging. Countries borrowed heavily, projects stalled, revenues fell short, debts piled up, and China's leverage grew. A small African copper-dependent nation, Zambia, borrowed aggressively from China to modernize its economy. By 2020, 43% of its external debt was owed to Beijing. When the pandemic hit and copper demand collapsed, Zambia defaulted, its economy pushed to the brink. Then came the so-called white elephant projects, infrastructures so grand but so useless that they became symbols of failure. One of the most dramatic examples was in Montenegro, a small European nation that borrowed $1 billion from China to build a highway. But poor planning and corruption meant the money was spent on just 41 kilometers of road, ending abruptly in the mountains, connecting nothing to nowhere. The debt crippled Montenegro's economy, consuming more than 80% of its GDP, forcing the government to plead for Western help. BRI was no longer seen as a miracle. It was becoming a warning. As the Belt and Road Initiative expanded, the failures grew harder to hide. Nations that once celebrated China as a savior now faced stalled construction, empty megastructures, and debts that strangled their economies. The promises of prosperity were fading, replaced by political unrest, public anger, and a wave of investigations into corruption and mismanagement. One of the most shocking examples came again from Sri Lanka. Near the failed Hambantota port, the government built the Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, a project funded by a $200 million Chinese loan. It was advertised as the gateway to a new era of development. But airlines didn't come, passengers didn't come. The airport stood empty, earning the nickname the world's emptiest airport. At times, elephants wandered across the runway, silent witnesses to a dream that never materialized. Thousands of miles away in South America, the nation of Ecuador faced a similar tragedy. In hopes of solving its energy crisis, Ecuador partnered with China to build the Cococodo-Sinclair Dam, a $2.6 billion mega-project. But Chinese contractors ignored quality standards, bribed officials, and rushed through construction. Within years, engineers discovered 17,000 cracks across the dam's structure. Today, the dam stands on the brink of catastrophic collapse, threatening not just the economy, but hundreds of thousands of lives downstream. What was meant to be a symbol of progress has become a looming environmental and humanitarian disaster. Then came Pakistan, a country that once called China its iron brother. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, valued at over $60 billion, was marketed as the crown jewel of BRI. It promised new highways, power plants, and economic zones that would pull Pakistan out of its chronic energy shortages. But most of the projects fell behind schedule or stalled entirely. The port city of Gwadar, once envisioned as a future Dubai, descended into protests. Locals had no clean water, no electricity, and no jobs, despite the billions invested. And in the end, the Gwadar port, once controlled by Pakistan, shifted into the hands of China. 91% of its revenue now goes to Beijing. Pakistan, drowning under debt, receives the leftovers. In Europe, the shockwaves were just as strong. Italy became the only G7 nation to join BRI, believing Chinese investment would revive its stagnant economy. But the promised deals never materialized. Instead of growth, Italy gained little more than symbolic agreements and political backlash. Eventually, Rome declared joining BRI a big mistake and formally exited the initiative, an embarrassing blow to China's global ambitions. Other nations learned from these failures. Malaysia cancelled multiple BRI projects, Myanmar renegotiated terms, Bangladesh and Nepal walked away entirely. The illusion of BRI as a guaranteed win had shattered. Sensing global skepticism, the United States and Europe launched counter-initiatives, PGII, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and the EU SE Global Gateway, offering transparent financing and lower interest loans, targeting nations burned by China's debt traps. But these shifts had geopolitical consequences. As Western trust eroded, China found a new partner, Russia. After invading Ukraine, Russia grew isolated from the global financial system. Cut off from the West, Moscow warmed to Beijing's embrace. The Belt and Road gave them a strategic platform to align their interests, strengthening a new axis of power that could challenge American dominance in the years ahead. For China, the Belt and Road Initiative had become a double-edged sword. Its failures damaged China's reputation, slowed its economy, and labeled Beijing as a predatory lender. Yet at the same time, the initiative gave China influence over more than 100 strategic ports worldwide, critical nodes for global trade and for China's export-driven economy. The world began to ask, was BRI collapsing? Or was it evolving into something even more powerful? A decade after its grand unveiling, the Belt and Road Initiative stands at a crossroads. What was introduced as the project of the century has now become one of the most debated undertakings in modern geopolitics. Across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America, the results are etched in concrete. Unfinished highways, half-empty ports, failing dams, and nations struggling beneath mountains of debt. The most painful truth is this: BRI was never truly about development. It was about power, China's power. And for many countries, the price of believing in that promise has been devastating. Yet for China, the story is more complicated. Beijing expected BRI to be the engine of a new world order, a network stretching from the Pacific to Europe, connecting 65% of the global population. It hoped to export its surplus labor, its materials, its technology, and cement influence across continents. But instead, China now carries the weight of unpaid loans, failing assets, and political backlash from nations that once welcomed it with open arms. The label debt-trap diplomacy has stuck like a stain, damaging China's global image. And its own economy, once fueled by endless construction, has slowed dramatically. Every port taken over, every half-built railway, Every white elephant project has become a liability Beijing must manage, maintain, or revive. The financial burden is enormous, but China also gained something immense: strategic footholds across the world. Over 100 ports, directly or indirectly linked to Chinese firms, now connect oceans, trade routes, and emerging markets back to Beijing. This network, if completed as envisioned, could redefine the global flow of goods. It would be the longest chain of road, rail, and sea connectivity on Earth, an economic artery, running from Asia into the heart of Europe. Still, the backlash was impossible to ignore. So China began redesigning its vision. BRI is now being rebranded as BRI 2.0, a sleeker, more cautious version focused on digital infrastructure, renewable energy, fiber optic cables, and sustainability. Instead of massive, risky mega projects, China is pivoting to projects that require lower investment but offer higher strategic leverage: data, telecommunications, and cyber connectivity. But the world has changed too. Nations no longer sign agreements blindly. After seeing the collapse of Sri Lanka, the cracks in Ecuador's dam, the stagnation in Pakistan, and the crushing debts of Zambia, governments now demand transparency, economic viability, and long-term sustainability. They know that not every shiny blueprint leads to progress, and not every partnership brings prosperity. America and Europe have stepped into the vacuum with competing initiatives, offering alternatives to BRI with promises of better governance and lower risk. The global tug-of-war has intensified. Nations caught in the middle must now choose not just an investment partner, but a geopolitical future. Meanwhile, China has leaned closer to Russia, a relationship strengthened by shared isolation and strategic need. As Russia confronts Western sanctions, China gains a partner willing to cooperate on global infrastructure, energy, and trade. Together, they shape a new geopolitical axis that challenges the Western-led world order. So after $1 trillion and 10 turbulent years, one question remains: did China succeed, or did it fail? The answer lies somewhere in between. BRI did not reshape the world the way Beijing envisioned. It did not create a seamless global network under Chinese leadership. It did not make China the uncontested economic center of the world. But neither did it collapse completely. Instead, it morphed into something more strategic, more digital, and more subtle. A quiet network of influence rather than a loud parade of mega projects. For the nations caught in its orbit, the lesson is clear. Development cannot be borrowed. It must be built with foresight, realism, and transparency. Dreams funded by debt can easily turn into chains. The Belt and Road Initiative now stands as a monument to ambition, both its power and its peril. Some countries gained hope, others lost sovereignty, and China discovered that shaping the world is far more difficult than building railways and ports. As the next chapter unfolds, one thing is certain: BRI has already altered the political landscape of the 21st century. Whether it becomes a bridge to cooperation or a battlefield of influence will depend on the choices nations make next, and the lessons they choose to remember.